What does it mean to be born into a dynasty? When your last name is Redgrave, you are not just an actress, you are acting royalty. Your path seems set. But what if the person at the center of that legacy, the heir to the throne, never really wanted it? What if she spent her entire life fighting that incredible consuming shadow, only to forge an identity, a family, and a triumph that was entirely her own? This is the story of Natasha Richardson. We may know her name from the headlines of a devastating modern tragedy, but the real story is not about the suddenness of its end. It is about the vibrant, complex, and deeply human life she lived. It's a story of incredible privilege and profound private pain. A story of a woman who possessed a quiet strength, becoming a guardian to the great loves of her life, her brilliant, complex father as he died of AIDS, and her superstar husband as he battled addiction. This is the story of how she won her battle for identity, only to have that brilliant life stolen by a single, tiny moment of chance, a twist of fate that remains impossible to comprehend. And it's the story of how that loss, in its final generous act, became an unexpected legacy all its own. To understand the woman, the wife, the mother, and the star, you first have to understand the incredible and incredibly heavy world she was born into. You have to go back past the spotlight, past the tragedy, back to the very beginning, back to Berkeley. The dynasty was founded by her grandparents, Sir Michael Redgrave and Rachel Kempson. Sir Michael was a Titan, a contemporary of Laurence Olivier and John Gielgud, a man who defined Shakespeare for a generation. He was a brooding, brilliant, and complex intellectual. Rachel Kempson was the family's elegant, steadfast matriarch. But the true, explosive, global power of that name came from their children. There was Lynn Redgrave, an Oscar-nominated, joyful, and brilliant comedic and dramatic actress. There was Corin Redgrave, a formidable stage actor and perhaps more famously, a fiery, far-left political activist. And then there was Vanessa. When Natasha Jane Richardson was born on May 11th, 1963, her mother, Vanessa Redgrave, was not just an actress. She was a force of nature. She was a global icon of the 1960s swinging London scene, a statuesque, luminous, and breathtakingly talented performer who was already being called the greatest actress of her generation. She was also famously a political firebrand. Her Trotskyist revolutionary politics were as much a part of her identity as her acting. She was beautiful, she was brilliant, and she was, to many, terrifyingly intense. This was the woman who was Mum. Natasha's father was no less a giant. Tony Richardson was not a Redgrave, but he was a key architect of his era. He was an Oscar-winning director, a leader of the British new wave of filmmaking. His films, like Look Back in Anger and The Entertainer, were gritty, realistic, kitchen sink dramas that stood in stark opposition to the polished fantasies of Hollywood. Natasha was, quite literally, the product of the two most powerful artistic and intellectual movements of her time, the classical theatrical dynasty of the Redgraves and the rebellious anti-establishment cinema of the New Wave. She was born in Marylebone, London, and for a brief shining moment, her parents were the golden couple of this new creative and political world. That world, however, was a house of cards. In 1967, when Natasha was just 4 years old, her parents' marriage collapsed. The why was a complicated adult secret that would nonetheless define her childhood. Her father, Tony Richardson, had begun a public affair with the French actress Jeanne Moreau, but the private truth, which would become public much later, was that he was bisexual. The divorce was a seismic event. The Golden family fractured. Tony Richardson moved for the most part to Hollywood, building a new life. Vanessa, meanwhile, threw herself even more deeply into her work and her radical politics, often taking her two daughters, Natasha and her younger sister Jolie, with her to protest marches and political rallies. This was the backdrop of Natasha's childhood. It was a world of staggering privilege and profound emotional instability. It was a childhood of backstage nurseries at the Royal Shakespeare Company. It was a childhood of weekends at glittering Hollywood parties and weekdays at somber political meetings. She and Jolie were shuttled between two worlds, two continents, and two parents who were, in their own ways, larger than life. This upbringing forged in her a set of contradictions. She became fiercely independent, almost defiantly self-sufficient. She developed a poise and a grace far beyond her years, a kind of social armor to navigate the chaos. But beneath it, she was, as her friends would later say, deeply sensitive, carrying the wounds of that early family rupture. More than anything, she was defined by her relationship with the two gravitational poles of her life: her father, whom she adored with a fierce, protective loyalty, and her mother, whom she admired with a love that was mixed with an almost crippling sense of awe. It is perhaps the greatest and least known secret of her early life. The heiress to the Redgrave throne wanted to abdicate. From her earliest conscious moments, Natasha was Vanessa Redgrave's daughter. She looked like her, the same luminous skin, the wide, intelligent eyes. And everyone, from teachers to journalists to family friends, simply assumed she would follow the path. This assumption became a prison. She was terrified of the comparison. How could she possibly measure up to the woman the world called the greatest actress alive? She feared that any success she had would be dismissed as simple nepotism, and she feared even more that she would try and fail and publicly humiliate the family name. In an interview years later, she explained this early resistance. "I was absolutely certain I would not act," she said. "I think it was a very conscious, rebellious, 'No, I'm not going to do it,' because I was frightened." This fear drove her to find her own identity. She was not just a Redgrave, she was Natasha. While her mother was a political firebrand, Natasha was a social grace. While her mother was a tempest, Natasha was the calm center. She was the family's fixer, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who mediated arguments, the one who, even as a teenager, seemed to be the most adult person in the room. Her education became her first escape. She was enrolled in two of London's most prestigious private schools, the Lycée Français Charles de Gaulle and St. Paul's Girls' School in Hammersmith. This dual education was a gift from her parents. At the lycée, she became perfectly, effortlessly bilingual in French, a skill that gave her a sophisticated continental air, separate from her purely British family. At St. Paul's, she was given a rigorous classical academic education, proving she had the intellect of the Redgraves, not just the talent. She considered other careers. For a time, she thought she might be a journalist. She was an excellent writer. She was curious, smart, and articulate. Anything but the stage. But the inheritance was too strong. The simple genetic need to perform, to tell stories, was in her blood. She later said the turning point came when, as a teenager, she performed in a school play. It was the first time she had ever truly acted. And the feeling of commanding a stage, of disappearing into a character, of connecting with an audience, it was, she admitted, like a drug. She had found her calling, but she was determined to do it her way. She would not be Vanessa Redgrave's daughter. She would be Natasha Richardson, a trained professional working actress. She refused to use her family connections to skip the line. She auditioned for and was accepted into one of London's most prestigious and demanding drama schools, the central school of speech and drama. This was her declaration of independence. She was going to learn the craft from the ground up. She trained, she studied, she failed, and she grew far from the spotlight that constantly followed her mother. And it was here that she found her own voice. She was not a tempest like Vanessa. Her teachers and fellow students, who included at the time other future stars like Ralph Fiennes, saw something different. She had a modern, nervous, intelligent energy. She had a vulnerability that was electrifying, and she had a surprising, throaty, and powerful singing voice. But she was also, at heart, a pragmatist. The Redgrave name might open a door, but she knew it was work that would build a career. Before she even graduated, she took a job that proved her seriousness. In 1984, she left the prestigious London school midstream to join the Leeds Playhouse, a repertory theater company hundreds of miles north of London. This was a critical choice. This was not the glamorous West End. This was rep. This was the theatrical equivalent of the minor leagues. It was grueling, low-paying work, performing a different play every few weeks to small regional audiences. It was here, in the cold, unglamorous world of rep, that she truly shed the Redgrave skin and became a professional. She was, at last, ready. In 1985, the inevitable finally happened. A producer had a brilliant idea to stage Anton Chekhov's masterpiece, The Seagull, in London's West End. And, in a piece of casting that was either a masterstroke of genius or a cruel, publicity-driven gimmick, they cast Vanessa Redgrave as the grand aging actress Arkadina and 22-year-old Natasha Richardson, in her official West End debut as the young, hopeful, and ultimately tragic actress Nina. The night of the opening was electric. The London press was assembled, their knives out, ready for the slaughter. Can the cub play the lion's game? One critic wondered. The entire theatrical world was there to see one thing: Vanessa and her daughter. The curtain rose, and from the moment Natasha stepped on stage, the narrative was rewritten. She was not her mother. She was, as one critic famously wrote, a different but equally bright light. She was luminous. She was heartbreaking. She didn't just hold her own against the greatest actress of her generation. She matched her. The duel of mother and daughter on stage became a breathtaking collaborative dance. Natasha Richardson had arrived, but this debut, this triumph, was also the beginning of a new, lifelong struggle. She had proven she could act. She had survived the comparison. But the comparison would never go away. For the rest of her life, in review after review, in interview after interview, she would be Natasha Richardson, daughter of Vanessa Redgrave. Her victory in The Seagull had not set her free. It had only solidified her role as the crown princess, the heiress apparent to a throne she wasn't sure she ever wanted. Her new battle was no longer if she should act. It was how to build a career, a body of work, and an identity that was at last entirely and uniquely her own. This new battle for her artistic soul would define the next decade of her life. Having survived the impossible comparison to her mother on the London stage, Natasha's strategy became simple. She would go where her mother was not. While the world expected a new Vanessa, a classical, sweeping, passionate performer, Natasha would run as fast as she could in the opposite direction. She would trade the hallowed halls of Shakespeare for the gritty, dangerous, and politically charged world of independent film, a calculated punk rock act of rebellion to build a career that was undeniably her own. Natasha's strategy was simple. She would go where her mother was not. Vanessa Redgrave was, by the mid-1980s, an almost mythical figure of the classical stage and art house cinema. Her brand was one of high-minded, often political passion. So Natasha's first major film role after her Seagull triumph was a deliberate punk rock act of rebellion. In 1986, she signed on to star in Gothic, directed by the cinematic madman Ken Russell. This was not Hamlet. This was not a polite merchant ivory costume drama. Gothic was a wild, sexually charged, and deeply bizarre psychological horror film. It was an opulent, fever dream portrayal of the famous night that Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Mary Godwin, the future Mary Shelley, gathered at a villa to tell ghost stories the night Frankenstein was born. Natasha played Mary. It was a role that required her to be intelligent, vulnerable, and completely uninhibited. The film was a maelstrom of surreal imagery, sexuality, and Gothic terror. For the crown princess of the Redgrave dynasty, it was a shocking, electrifying, and incredibly brave choice. It was, in effect, her saying, "I am not my mother. I am my generation." She had proven she had edge. Now she needed to prove she had depth. She found the perfect and perhaps most difficult role to do it. In 1988, director Paul Schrader, a man known for dark, obsessive, male-centric films like Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, was mounting his most ambitious project, the story of Patty Hearst. This was not a historical epic. This was a raw, recent, and profoundly traumatic American wound. Patty Hearst, the heiress kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, in 1974, was not a character. She was a living, breathing, and deeply controversial public figure. The entire film hinged on one terrifying question. Was she a brainwashed victim or a willing terrorist? For a 25-year-old British actress to take on this role was a staggering gamble. It required more than talent. It required a kind of journalistic, psychological bravery. Natasha dove in. She cut off her signature blonde hair, adopting Hearst's mousy brown look. She dieted, making herself look gaunt and frail. But the real work was internal. She had to portray the process of brainwashing. She had to spend the majority of the film blindfolded, locked in a closet. Her entire performance conveyed through a trembling voice and a palpable sense of terror. The film was brutal. It was claustrophobic. And her performance was a masterpiece of control. She didn't judge Patty Hearst. She became her. She showed the audience the systematic erasure of a personality, the slow, horrifying journey from a terrified aristocratic girl to Tanya, the blank-eyed urban guerrilla. The film was a commercial failure. It was far too dark for mainstream audiences, but it was a massive critical success for Natasha. She had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she was not just an heiress. She was a serious, formidable, and transformative artist, capable of tackling the most complex, modern, and dangerous roles of her time. She had proven she was different from her mother. Now she was about to prove how she was, in the most important way, exactly the same. If there was one gene that truly united the Redgrave clan, it wasn't acting, it was activism. Her mother, Vanessa, and her uncle, Corin, were famously, and often controversially, on the front lines of every major left-wing political battle. Natasha had inherited that fire, but she, as always, channeled it in her own, more subversive way. In 1989, she signed on to a film that was, at the time, a massive risk. It was an adaptation of a dark, complex, and deeply feminist novel by a Canadian author named Margaret Atwood. The book, published just 4 years earlier, was The Handmaid's Tale. Today we see The Handmaid's Tale as a global phenomenon, a cultural touchstone. In 1989, it was a piece of niche, speculative, political fiction. The Cold War was not yet over. The idea of a far-right Christian fundamentalist America was, to many, a remote fantasy. The film, directed by Volker Schlöndorff with a script by Harold Pinter, was one of the first and most serious dystopian films of the modern era, and Natasha was its star. She played Offred, the handmaid forced into sexual servitude in the totalitarian Republic of Gilead. This was not Patty Hearst. This was not a true story. This was a warning. And her performance was again a masterclass in quiet, subversive power. Opposite the theatrical, operatic performances of Robert Duvall as the commander and Faye Dunaway as Serena Joy, Natasha was a picture of stillness, of internal terror. Her entire performance is in her eyes. It's in the way she holds her breath. She plays a woman who is performing a role, the role of the obedient, pious handmaid, while desperately, silently, trying to keep her own identity, her real name, June, alive inside her. It was in a strange way the story of her own life, a woman playing a role that the world had assigned her while fighting to protect the true self within. The film, like Patty Hearst, was not a box office smash. It was too bleak, too strange, too political. But it was, once again, a profound statement. She was using her art, her fame, to say something. She was carrying the red grave torch of political activism, but she was doing it not on a protest line, but on the screen. She was, as she had always wanted, making her own mark. By 1990, she was a certified star. She was the it girl of the serious, independent film world. She was living in London, and her personal life seemed to be settling too. That year, she married Robert Fox. Fox was not an actor. He was a powerful, respected theater producer. He was, in effect, theater royalty in his own right. They had met during the Seagull. Their marriage was a perfect union of art and commerce, a true power couple of the London theater world. She was 27 years old. She was a respected film star. She was a Redgrave, and she was a Fox. Her life was, it seemed, perfectly in control. And then, just as she was at the peak of this first wave of success, her entire world was shattered by a phone call. It was about her father. This is the chapter of her life that truly defines the woman behind the actress. It's the story of her greatest and most private performance. Her father, Tony Richardson, the man who had directed Tom Jones, the brilliant bisexual artist who had broken her mother's heart but never ever lost hers, was dying. The year was 1990. The diagnosis was AIDS. Today, it is difficult to conjure the sheer primal terror of that word in that era. In 1990, AIDS was not a chronic illness. It was a death sentence. It was a gay plague. It was a disease wrapped in layers of fear, homophobia, and a profound, agonizing social stigma. Friends disappeared, families disowned their sons, hospitals at times turned patients away. It was a time of whispers, of shame, and of profound, isolating fear. Natasha, who was just 27 and newly married, did not hesitate. Her sister Jolie did not hesitate. While the world and many in Hollywood looked away from the man who was now a pariah, his daughters, his dynasty, flew to his side. They became his primary caregivers. This was not a glamorous Hollywood death. This was a brutal, wasting illness. Natasha, the elegant film star, the London socialite, became a nurse. She moved in, she managed his medications, she held him, she cleaned him, she fed him, and most importantly, she protected him. She stood guard, a lioness, as one friend called her, against the press, against the whispers, against the stigma. Imagine the psychological weight. This was the man whose abandonment had defined her childhood. This was the man whose complex sexuality had fractured her family. And here, in his final, most vulnerable moments, she was his guardian. She was, as she had always been, the fixer. Tony Richardson died on November 14th, 1991. He was 63. Natasha was heartbroken. but the experience, as agonizing as it was, forged her. It turned her grief into a lifelong, white-hot, righteous anger. She immediately joined the board of AMFAR, the Foundation for AIDS Research, a group then being championed by her friend Elizabeth Taylor. This was not a celebrity whim. This was not a cause. This was a vow. This was a daughter's promise, made in the trenches of a plague. For the rest of her life, she would be one of the organization's most effective, most passionate, and most relentless advocates. She hosted the galas. She worked the phones. She raised millions of dollars for the research that would eventually turn that death sentence into a manageable illness. Her father's death gave her a new, profound, and public purpose, one that had nothing to do with acting. It also left her at a personal crossroads. Her marriage to Robert Fox, strained by the grief and the long transatlantic commutes, was beginning to fray. Her film career, while respected, had not produced a major hit. She was 29 years old. Her father was gone. Her marriage was struggling. She was once again a woman in search of a new chapter, and she found it where the Redgraves always find their truth, on the stage. In 1992, Natasha decided to make her official Broadway debut. She was done with London, done with the Redgrave comparisons. She would conquer New York, the toughest theater town in the world, on her own terms. The play she chose was a monster, Eugene O'Neill's Anna Christie. This was not a polite play. It was a gritty, brutal American masterpiece. The role of Anna is one of the most demanding in the modern canon. A tough, cynical, world-weary Swedish immigrant who has been a prostitute and who is, against all odds, redeemed by the sea. It was the perfect anti-Redgrave role. It was earthy, raw, and required a deep, guttural, American-style realism. The producers at the Roundabout Theater Company began searching for her co-star, the rough-necked Irish-American sailor, Matt Burke, who would save her. They landed on a surprising choice, a 40-year-old Irish actor named Liam Neeson. Today we see Liam Neeson as a global superstar, an elder statesman of action films. In 1992, he was not. He was a respected working actor known for films like Darkman and A Prayer for the Dying. He was tall, rugged, and intensely masculine. He was a man's man, a former boxer, and he was not known as a theater actor. The two stars met for the first rehearsal. She was the 29-year-old, married, sophisticated, bilingual crown princess of the theater. He was the 40-year-old, rough-hewn, Belfast brawler with a reputation as a serious ladies' man. The chemistry, as one observer put it, was not just chemistry, it was a bonfire. It was, by all accounts, immediate. It was palpable. It was a connection so intense it stunned them both. Neeson, who had dated a string of famous actresses, had never, as he later said, felt anything like it. He was completely, utterly, and totally captivated. She was too. But there was a profound adult problem. She was married. They tried to keep it professional. They poured this overwhelming, forbidden energy into the play, and the result was theatrical dynamite. When Anna Christie opened in 1993, the reviews were ecstatic. The New York Times critic Frank Rich wrote a legendary review, not just of the play, but of the connection between its two stars. He called their pairing a sight to behold, a bonfire that warms all of New York. He wrote, "This is what it feels like to fall in love." The play was a smash hit. Natasha Richardson, in her first ever Broadway role, was nominated for a Tony Award. She had at last conquered New York entirely on her own. But the bonfire on stage was not an act. The same year, 1993, as this passionate, all-consuming, and scandalous affair was happening, Hollywood came calling for them both. Steven Spielberg was casting his passion project, Schindler's List. Liam Neeson was a top contender for the lead, Oscar Schindler, and Natasha Richardson, at the peak of her Anna Christie fame, was a top contender for one of the female supporting roles. Imagine the pressure. She was falling in love with a new man. She was in the painful, agonizing process of ending her marriage to Robert Fox. And now, she and her new, not yet public lover were in the running for the most important and most prestigious film of the decade. It was a tangled, complex, and deeply human mess. In the end, Liam, of course, got the part. Oscar Schindler would make him one of the biggest and most respected movie stars on the planet. Natasha did not get the part, but it didn't matter. The Anna Christie affair had clarified everything. She knew this was not a fling. This was her life. She and Robert Fox divorced. And in the summer of 1994, just months after Schindler's List had made him a global icon, Liam Neeson and Natasha Richardson were married on their secluded farm in upstate New York. Natasha, now 31, had finally truly stepped out of the shadow. She had endured the death of her father. She had triumphed on Broadway. And she had found a love that was entirely her own. She was no longer just Vanessa's daughter. She was the star of Broadway. And she was Mrs. Liam Neeson. She had at last forged her own dynasty. This new dynasty, forged in the emotional fire of Broadway and the sudden glare of global superstardom, needed a sanctuary. Natasha and Liam were not just any Hollywood couple. They were serious artists, and their first act as a married couple was a conscious, deliberate retreat from the very world that had just crowned them. This was the beginning of her golden age, a decade and a half defined by the one thing she had craved since childhood, a stable, loving home. But this new life as a wife and mother would also bring her greatest professional triumphs and her most profound private struggles. They did not buy a mansion in Beverly Hills. They did not settle in London. Instead, they bought a sprawling, rustic 1810 farmhouse in the quiet, secluded countryside of Millbrook, New York, 2 hours north of the city. This was not just a house, this was a sanctuary. For Natasha, this was a profoundly symbolic act. This was her creating the one thing she had never truly had as a child, a stable home, a single, safe, private place, far from the glare of the paparazzi, far from the chaotic political rallies of her mother, far from the restless energy of her globe-trotting father. This was where she would build her dynasty, and that dynasty began almost immediately. In 1995, she gave birth to their first son, Michael. A year and a half later, in 1996, their second son, Daniel, was born. Motherhood became the new, undisputed center of her universe. Her entire career from this moment on would be recalibrated. Every choice she made, every film, every play, was now measured against one simple question. Does it work for my family? She became, as her friends would describe, the sun around which their family orbited. She was a meticulous planner, a devoted, hands-on mother who insisted on driving her kids to school herself. She was the one who managed their sanctuary. Liam Neeson was the global movie star, but Natasha Richardson was the CEO of their life. And it was in these early, happy, golden years that the two of them, blissfully in love, made a pact. It was the kind of romantic, abstract, philosophical promise that only people who feel completely safe can make. They promised each other, as Liam would later recount, that if either one of them ever ended up in a vegetative state, a life sustained only by tubes and machines, the other one would pull the plug. It was a vow sealed in love, a promise between two healthy, vibrant people at the peak of their lives. A promise that, at the time, seemed like it would never need to be kept. With her two young sons, Natasha's professional choices shifted. The dark, gritty political roles of Patty Hearst and The Handmaid's Tale gave way to a new priority. But that didn't mean she stopped working, it just meant she was looking for something different. In 1997, the director Nancy Meyers, the queen of the modern, sophisticated romantic comedy, was casting her directorial debut. It was an ambitious, high-concept remake of a 1961 Disney classic. The film was The Parent Trap. The concept was tricky. A single young actress, an unknown teenager named Lindsay Lohan, would play identical twins, separated at birth, who conspire to get their divorced parents back together. For the role of the father, they cast the suave, handsome Dennis Quaid. For the role of the mother, Elizabeth James, a sophisticated, elegant, and famously successful British wedding gown designer. Meyers needed someone specific. She needed an actress who could be believably British royalty, but who also had a warm, accessible, and slightly flustered comedic timing. She needed Natasha Richardson. It was the role that would define her for an entire generation. Her performance in The Parent Trap is, in many ways, the perfection of her public image. She is breathtakingly beautiful, stylish, and impossibly elegant. But she is also warm, funny, and deeply, achingly loving. When her daughter, Hallie, pretending to be Annie, smells her hair and says, "You smell like lemons and something else, sunshine," Natasha's reaction, a mix of confusion, warmth, and a buried, forgotten love, is a masterclass. Why was she so perfect? Because she was, in essence, playing a fantasy version of her own life. She was playing the perfect mother, the kind of stable, joyful, wealthy, and hopelessly romantic matriarch that her own chaotic childhood had lacked. She was projecting the very family life that she was at that exact moment so dedicated to building on her farm in Millbrook. The film, released in 1998, was a massive global hit. It made Lindsay Lohan a star, and it made Natasha Richardson, who had spent a decade as the queen of the dark, independent art house film, into something new, a beloved international icon. She was, to the millions of millennials who grew up watching that film, the perfect mom. She had the hit film. She had the movie star husband. She had the beautiful children. She had, it seemed, won the game of life. And now, with that commercial success secure, she was going to return to her first and truest love, the stage, for the greatest artistic gamble and the single greatest triumph of her entire career. While Natasha was planning The Parent Trap, a brilliant young British director named Sam Mendes was tearing up the London theater scene. He had a revolutionary idea for the classic Candor and Ebb musical, Cabaret. He hated the polite Broadway versions of the show. He wanted to take it back to its dark German Weimar roots. He wanted it to be dangerous. His idea was to stage it not in a theater, but in an actual seedy, transformed nightclub. The audience would sit at tiny, rickety tables. They would be served warm champagne by waiters in torn stockings. The line between audience and performer would be erased. His production of Cabaret became the hottest ticket in London, and in 1997 he was bringing it to New York. He needed a new Sally Bowles. This role is one of the holy grails for an actress. It was made immortal by Liza Minnelli in a powerhouse, iconic, Oscar-winning film performance. To step into those shoes was considered by many to be artistic suicide. Mendes did not want a singer who could act. He wanted an actress who could sing. He needed a woman who was not just a belter, but who was smart, tragic, and utterly heartbreaking. He needed someone who could show the desperate, terrifying political reality beneath the sequins. He needed Natasha Richardson. When she accepted, the theater world was stunned. Why would the elegant classical Redgrave, the new star of a Disney family film, the wife of Liam Neeson, choose to do this? To play a desperate, drug-addled, third-rate nightclub singer 8 times a week in a cramped, immersive, and physically demanding show? Because it was exactly what she needed to do. It was the one great role that was totally, completely, terrifyingly hers. Her mother had never played it. It had no classical baggage. It was modern, dark, sexual, and raw. Her interpretation of Sally Bowles was a revelation. It was the opposite of Liza Minnelli's. Liza's Sally was a force of nature, a talent too big for the room. Natasha's Sally was not a great singer, and that was the entire heartbreaking point. When she sang, you heard the British accent, the forced cheerfulness, the notes she strained to hit. She wasn't a powerhouse. She was an actress, playing a woman who was trying to be a star and failing, all while the world was collapsing into Nazism around her. She was desperate. She was fragile. She was, as one critic wrote, the most heartbreaking Sally Bowles ever seen. She was raw, fearless, and utterly transcendent. This, not a Hollywood blockbuster, was her true artistic peak. This was the moment she synthesized everything: her British legacy, her edgy political film work, her flawless stage technique, and her raw emotional vulnerability. This was also the role that corrected the Evita myth. While the press had buzzed about her being a contender for the film of Evita, which ultimately went to Madonna, Natasha had known that Cabaret was the real prize. The stage, not the screen, was her kingdom. In June 1998, just 1 month before The Parent Trap would make her a household name, Natasha Richardson, the dynasty kid who was afraid to act, the girl who was terrified of her mother's shadow, won the Tony Award for Best Actress in a Musical. She had done it. She had won Broadway's highest honor in a musical, in a role that was entirely her own. She had at last stepped fully into the light. From 1998 onward, Natasha Richardson and Liam Neeson were the undisputed king and queen of the New York art world. They were the perfect couple, two staggering talents, impossibly beautiful, fiercely intelligent, wildly in love, and devoted to their 2 sons. They hosted legendary dinner parties at their Millbrook farm. They were the anchors of their community. She was a soccer mom who just happened to be a Tony-winning Redgrave. He was a global movie star who was known in town as the quiet dad who liked to fly fish. But as with all perfect lives, the reality was far more human. Beneath the golden couple myth, the family was about to face its most profound private struggle. And once again, Natasha would be called upon to be the guardian. On July 17, 2000, Liam Neeson was riding his Harley-Davidson motorcycle near their home when a deer bolted onto the road. He swerved, crashed into an embankment, and shattered his pelvis. The accident was catastrophic. He was airlifted to a hospital. He survived, but the recovery was long and agonizing. Natasha once again became a nurse. She managed his recovery. She held the family together. But the accident, this sudden brush with his own mortality, rattled Neeson to his core. As he would admit years later, in the years following the accident, he began to drink heavily. He was in pain. He was grappling with his fame. He was, as he put it, a classic Irish stereotype, using whiskey to numb the trauma and the pressure. It was not a public, falling down drunk addiction. It was a private, functioning, but deeply destructive alcoholism. This was the great secret of their golden years. Natasha, the woman who had nursed her father through his final fatal illness, now found herself fighting for the life of her husband. She did not do it with drama. She did not do it with hysterics or threats. She did it, as always, with a core of profound, loving, and non-negotiable strength. Liam later told the story. He had been drinking too much. It was starting to spiral. One day, Natasha, with that famous, direct Redgrave poise, simply came to him and said, "Liam, this isn't working. You have to get help. This is not you." It was not an attack. It was a statement of fact, an act of love. As a friend would later say, she was his rock. She was the only person on earth who could get through to him. Her intervention worked. He went to rehab. He got sober. This, more than any film role, more than any play, was who Natasha Richardson truly was. She was the family's guardian. She was the fixer. She was the woman who saved the men she loved. She was the one who was always in control, the one who held the chaotic, brilliant, artistic world of her family together through sheer force of will. With her husband sober, her children thriving, and her Tony Awards secured, Natasha settled into the 2000s as the undisputed matriarch of her own dynasty. She continued to work, but only on her own terms. Her choices were, as always, eclectic and intelligent. She played the sophisticated other woman in the Jennifer Lopez rom-com Made in Manhattan. She dove back into dark, psychological territory with 2005's Asylum, a chilling sexual drama that earned her critical raves. She returned to Broadway, alongside John C. Reilly, in A Streetcar Named Desire, bravely taking on Blanche Dubois, a role her mother had famously played. But her real work, her core work, remained threefold. First, her family. She was a mother, first and foremost. She was known in her town simply as Tasha, the mom who hosted the best Halloween parties and never missed a school play. Second, her advocacy. Her work with MFAR was relentless. She had joined the board in 2006. By 2009, she had personally helped raise over $10 million for AIDS research. This was her father's legacy, and she carried it with a sacred devotion. Third, her life with Liam. Their marriage had survived fame, addiction, and tragedy. It was now deeper, stronger, and more real than ever. There were, of course, the small human contradictions. The woman who was a global champion for public health was herself a habitual smoker. It was her one vice, a classic fixer's flaw. The person so busy taking care of everyone else, she forgets to take care of herself. In 2008, her life seemed almost perfect. Her husband's career had exploded in an entirely new direction. The 2008 film, Taken, had unexpectedly made him the world's most bankable action star. Her sons were happy, thriving teenagers, and she had just completed work on a light-hearted, fun teen comedy called Wild Child, playing the warm, elegant headmistress of a British boarding school. It was in many ways the Elizabeth James character, all grown up. Her next project was already set. In what would be a triumphant full-circle moment, she and her mother, Vanessa Redgrave, were scheduled to return to Broadway, together, to star in a revival of the Stephen Sondheim musical A Little Night Music. She was 45 years old. She was vibrant, beloved, and at the absolute peak of her powers. She had beaten the Redgrave shadow. She had it all. In March 2009, with her sons on spring break, she decided to take them for a short ski vacation to a chic resort in Quebec called Mont Tremblant. It was just a quick mother-son trip before she had to start rehearsals for Broadway. This perfect golden life, so meticulously built and fiercely protected, was about to be undone by a single, infinitesimal moment of chance. This trip to Mont Tremblant, a simple spring break vacation with her sons before starting her next creative chapter, was the stage. But it was set not for her triumphant return to Broadway, but for a random, senseless, and devastatingly modern tragedy. On March 16, 2009, on a clear, beautiful spring day. The woman who was the definition of grace and control would take a simple fall and set in motion a chain of events that would stun the world. March 16th, 2009. It was a beautiful, clear spring day. Natasha was not an expert skier. She was a novice. She wasn't on a dangerous black diamond run. She was on the Nansen, a wide, gentle, bright green bunny slope, the resort's main run for total beginners. She was with a ski instructor, learning the basics. She was not wearing a helmet. In 2009, this was not unusual. Helmets were still seen by many as optional, something for racers or daredevils, not for someone on a beginner hill. As she neared the bottom of the slope, she caught an edge. It was not a dramatic high-speed crash. Eyewitnesses described it as a tumble, a simple, silly, low-speed fall. She slid, and the side of her head, just above the ear, struck the hard, packed snow. She didn't lose consciousness. She didn't even seem fazed. As the instructor and a ski patroller rushed to her side, she did exactly what any of us would do. She laughed. She laughed it off. She insisted, "Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine." They offered to strap her to a backboard and take her to the clinic. She politely but firmly refused all medical aid. She was Natasha Richardson. She was a Redgrave. She was fine. This was the single most critical and most fatal decision of her life. She was escorted back to her hotel room by her instructor. At the hotel, she once again refused to see a doctor. She was, after all, feeling perfectly normal. She signed a medical waiver absolving the resort of responsibility. She was conscious. She was talking. She was laughing. She went to her room to rest. And as she sat there, alone, a silent, invisible, and terrifying clock began to tick. This is where Natasha's story ceases to be about fame and becomes a devastating modern medical lesson. What was happening inside her skull is the definition of a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's known as the lucid interval. When she fell, the light impact did one tiny catastrophic thing. It tore an artery that runs just inside the skull, right next to the temple, but outside the brain's protective lining, the dura. This is an epidural hematoma. Because the tear is in an artery, the blood pumps out with every heartbeat. But because it's bleeding outside the brain itself isn't immediately damaged. The victim feels fine. This is the lucid interval. The person talks, they walk, they laugh, they may not even have a headache. But all the while, that blood is relentlessly, rapidly pooling in the confined space of the skull. The pool, the hematoma, begins to grow, and the skull cannot expand. So the blood pool begins to compress the brain. It squeezes it. First, this compression causes a dull headache, then confusion. Then as the pressure builds, it begins to crush the most primitive, vital part of the brain, the brainstem, the part that controls breathing, consciousness, and every signal our body sends. This is the talk and die syndrome. The person is lucid until the moment the pressure becomes too great and the brain simply shuts down. It is one of the most fatal and one of the most survivable injuries in all of medicine. It is quite literally a race against time. If a patient during that lucid interval gets a CT scan, a doctor can see the blood pool instantly. A neurosurgeon can then drill a simple small burr hole in the skull, draining the blood. The pressure is relieved. The patient wakes up the next day and they go home. It is 100% survivable if you get help. Natasha, feeling fine, had signed a paper saying she didn't need it. The clock was ticking. About an hour after her fall, back in her hotel room, the headache started. It wasn't a migraine. It was a pressure she had never felt. She became confused. She knew something was terribly wrong. An ambulance was called. This is where the tragedy of chance becomes a tragedy of logistics. This is the great what if, the controversy that haunts her death. The ambulance arrived, but they did not take her to a major trauma hospital. They took her by law to the nearest designated clinic, the Centre Hospitalier Laurentien. This was a small local hospital completely unequipped to handle a catastrophic neurological event. The doctors there realized instantly that she was beyond their help. She needed a level 1 trauma center, and the closest one was in Montreal, an hour's drive away. She was loaded into another ambulance. By the time she was being raced down the highway to Montreal, the lucid interval was long over. The hematoma had grown to a catastrophic size. She had likely already lost consciousness in the first ambulance. The pressure inside her skull was crushing her brainstem. Hours, precious, vital, life-saving hours had been lost. At the same time, her husband Liam Neeson was on a film set in Toronto. He received a call. It was Tasha, but it wasn't her. It was a paramedic or a doctor. He has never fully described the call, only the cold, confusing terror of it. He left the set running. He got to his apartment, grabbed his passport, and chartered a private jet, racing to Montreal, still believing, praying that it was just a bad concussion, that she would be awake, that she would be Tasha. He arrived at the Hôpital du Sacré-Cœur, a frantic, loving husband, and walked into a nightmare. Liam Neeson would later describe what happened next. In a shattering interview with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes, he walked into the emergency room, and there's all these gurneys, and I'm looking for my wife. A doctor he had never met saw him, knew who he was, and led him to a small room. The doctor, he said, showed him an X-ray. It was, Neeson described, a snapshot. It showed his wife's brain, the massive black pool of the hematoma, and it showed her brain, the center of her, the woman he loved, squashed up against the side of the skull. And then the doctor said the words, "She is brain dead." He was led into her room. She was hooked up to a tangle of tubes, to a ventilator that was forcing air into her lungs. She was alive, but she was gone. And as Liam Neeson stood there in the buzzing, sterile light of a Canadian trauma ward, his world collapsing, he remembered their promise, that abstract, romantic pact they had made years earlier in their happy, safe life on the farm. If any of us gets into a vegetative state, we'd pull the plug. He described what he did next. I went into her and I told her I loved her. His voice, even years later, breaks when he tells this story. I said, sweetie, you're not coming back from this. You've banged your head. You're gone. You and I, we made a pact. He knew what he had to do. But she would not die here, in a strange hospital, in a strange city. He had to keep one last promise. He had to take her home. He had her still on life support, loaded onto a jet. He flew her from Montreal to New York City to Lenox Hill Hospital. This was not a medical transfer. This was not an attempt to save her. This was a final loving act. He was bringing her home so her family, her mother, her sister, her sons could say their goodbyes. The news had now broken to the world. The heartbreaking, surreal images began. Vanessa Redgrave, looking frail and shattered, being physically supported by friends as she walked into the hospital. Her sister, Jolie, her sons, the entire Redgrave dynasty, and the press corps of the world gathered for a final terrible vigil. On March 18, 2009, 2 days after she laughed and said, "I'm fine," after her family had said their last goodbyes, Natasha Richardson was taken off life support. She was 45 years old. The story does not end in that hospital room. Because of the pact she and Liam had made, because they had discussed the unthinkable, they had also discussed organ donation. In her final act on this earth, Natasha Richardson, the family guardian, became a guardian to strangers. Her heart, her liver, and both of her kidneys were successfully donated. She saved the lives of 3 other people. Her death, a seemingly random, senseless, and totally avoidable accident, sent a shock wave across the globe. The world was collectively stunned. People could not reconcile the cause and the effect. A beginner's slope, a simple fall, laughing and walking, and then dead? The result was an immediate, visceral, and global phenomenon that journalists dubbed the Natasha Richardson effect. Ski resorts and helmet manufacturers, who had for years struggled to convince the casual skier to wear a helmet, suddenly saw their sales spike by 50%, 100%, even 200%. Ski schools that had optional helmet policies were shamed almost overnight into making them mandatory, especially for children. Slopes that were once filled with bare heads were suddenly oceans of plastic. The phrase "pulling a Natasha" briefly and grimly entered the lexicon for skiing without protection. Her death became the single greatest catalyst for traumatic brain injury TBI awareness in the history of winter sports. Because she was a mother, because she was a wife, because she was so beloved, and because her death was so preventable, her story educated millions. She taught the world about the lucid interval. She taught parents everywhere that "I'm fine" is not an answer. It is incalculable, but it is certain that today there are thousands of people, children and adults, who are alive simply because Natasha Richardson died. It is her most profound and most accidental legacy. For her family, the loss is, of course, a wound that never heals. Liam Neeson has spoken with devastating honesty about his ocean of grief. Still, all these years later, expecting to hear her key in the door, but her true legacy, the one that perfectly closes the circle of her entire life struggle, came almost a decade after her death. In 2018, her son Michal, who is now an actor himself, legally changed his last name. He was no longer Michiel Neeson. He became Michael Richardson. He did it, he said, to honor his mother, to carry her name, her legacy, with him as he built his own career. Think of it. The woman who began her life so terrified of her family's shadow, who was so certain she wanted to abdicate her dynastic name, had in the end created a legacy of love so powerful, so profound, that her own son chose her name over the name of one of the biggest movie stars on earth. It is the final perfect, heartbreaking tribute. Her last film, Wild Child, was already in theaters, but her final performance, a documentary she had voiced called The Wildest Dream, was released in 2010, a year after she was gone. And so, audiences sat in a dark theater and heard her voice one last time, warm, intelligent, poised, and crackling with life. A voice that had been silenced, but that through her art, her children, her advocacy, and her final generous life-saving act has found a way to become truly immortal.